As you may know, I've often been skeptical of these hypothetical who would win scenarios. You know, like who would win, an armored chicken or a weasel with a miniature chainsaw? I don't know. Obviously, neither would stand a chance against a ninja rabbit. The way they often tend to happen, I find discussions like that a little pointless because they lack nuance. But you know what they say, rules are made to be broken. Who says that? Undercover agents, that's who. Anyway, I don't want to be a killjoy, and you don't have to be super scientific about it. It can just be for fun, musing a little bit about the differences and who has the better odds. So, what about Viking versus knight? For some reason, that's a very common combination. You know, pirates, Vikings, and knights, that mod for Half-Life all those years ago. It makes me feel old, it makes my knees hurt, but whatever. For Honor, obviously, is the most prominent example. Actually, no, I take that back. I refuse to acknowledge this nonsense. This is less historically accurate than Romans with machine guns. There are so many others. That's a rather popular pairing. What can we say about that? Well, first off, what kind of knight are we talking about? It makes a huge difference whether it's an early medieval knight, say 11th or 12th century, versus late medieval. I would say in historical fantasy, usually knights are some kind of amalgamation of 13th, 14th, and 15th century, with plenty of fantasy deviation, of course, or even later. In fact, some of the most iconic knightly armor tends to belong more in the 16th century. A Viking would belong in the time period between 792, the raid of the Lindisfarne monastery, and 1066, the Battle of Hastings, although personally I would say the Viking age ended in the year 1000, when Iceland officially adopted Christianity. Good job, guys. Okay, so for the sake of comparison, I generally like to assume ideal conditions. So each of the two fighters are like the prime specimen, maximum possible experience, skill, fitness, whatever that is reasonable for them. And, you know, ideal circumstances, level ground, nobody has any kind of advantage from the environment. They have the best equipment they can have. Everything is ideal, right? So what does that mean? A knight is a professional warrior. You know, it's a warrior class. Medieval society was organized around the three estate system. Those who work, those who fight, and those who pray. Commoners, nobles, and clergy. Of course, there were plenty of different occupations within those three, but if we're talking knights, we're talking a professional fighter. What's a Viking? Is that a professional warrior too? Not necessarily. Can be, but really anyone who went Viking was a Viking for the duration of the time. A short and sweet definition I like is an opportunistic seafaring adventurer. That puts it pretty well. So that could be a raider, a trader, or an explorer, or even a settler. You know, if you go explore and then you find a place you like and then you settle down, well, as soon as you settle down permanently, you're not a Viking anymore. But everything leading up to that makes you a Viking. Whatever personal background you may have, if you want to hop onto a boat and venture out into the world to extract wealth in one form or another, or make a name for yourself, there you go. You're a vikingr. What about physical ability? In fiction, Vikings are often portrayed as muscle-bound giants. How accurate is that? Well, take a guess. In the Viking Age, Scandinavians had a couple of centimeters on continental Europeans. It depends on exactly where you look. It's also worth keeping in mind that average height fluctuated throughout the Middle Ages. Of course, from the average height, you can be significantly taller or shorter. And it's reasonable to assume that taller, more heavily built men would more gravitate toward becoming Vikings. You know, whoever has the physical aptitude. Here's one thing to consider. When thinking about why Scandinavians were taller on average, the hypothesis is often that they had more protein in their diets because anyone could hunt. There were no nobles who owned the animals and the land and prohibited commoners from hunting them. And also they had access to plenty of fish, things like that. But of course, if we're comparing to a knight, we're talking about a noble. And again, a professional warrior who would, of course, have more protein in their diet compared to a peasant. So the ideal knight in this hypothetical encounter may not be much shorter than the ideal Viking, but it's safe to assume that the Viking is probably a little bit taller. might be a little more stoutly built, perhaps. If we look at the way the ideal build of a knight was portrayed in the Middle Ages, it's not a big hunking bodybuilder. It's a slender build with a narrow waist, comparatively broad shoulders, and not particularly beefy overall. Athletic, lean muscle with a good deal of explosive strength, but also plenty of endurance. So in direct comparison, I would assume the knight to be probably a little more martially well-rounded and have more extensive training under his belt, because he would start at a young age. And again, it was a full-time warrior. The Viking, some could very well make their living being a Viking. Obviously, fighting prowess was highly valued in Scandinavian society, and they would practice fighting in a number of ways. As a sport, for fun even, and Klima, an Icelandic martial arts system built mainly on grappling, with kicks and punches as well, survives to this day. Just like knights, they might fight in one-on-one duels, or small skirmishes, or larger battles. I would argue that a Viking is more of an adventurer or maybe a mercenary of sorts than a professional soldier. On average, a knight probably trains more and sees more battle, or at the very least large-scale battle. So I'm thinking in terms of physicality, the Viking may have a slight advantage, and in terms of skill, the knight may have a slight advantage. Emphasis on slight. If we're assuming ideal conditions, both are, as I said, like prime specimens, then I don't think there's that much of a difference necessarily. Depending on your background, your power level may vary substantially. If you're a farmer frustrated by one too many poor harvests, you're not going to be able to afford anywhere near as much as, say, a jarl who has a certain amount of wealth and can get armor and better weapons and all of that. You may just have to grab a carving axe and make your own shield, and there you go, axe and shield, that's all you got. But as I said earlier, I want to assume the ideal scenario. So a wealthy man going a Viking, someone who can afford the armor available, like a helmet. We have an awful lack of evidence of surviving helmets from the Viking Age. Aside from a few fragments, there are 2 complete helmets, and ironically the one I'm wearing is not among them because it's from the earlier Vendel period. There is the idea that they might have used leather helmets that simply didn't survive in the archaeological record, because obviously animal skin does not preserve very well, which is possible. Evidence of absence is not absence of... Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but at the same time, you also shouldn't go the opposite extreme and say, well, we have no evidence for it, but they definitely did it. Well, how would you know? Just because it makes sense? Well, maybe, but it's just a speculation. Anyway, so let's assume an iron helmet, mail hauberk, shield, a spear, a sword, and a sax, perhaps. And yes, of course, an axe. The majority of men who went Viking would not have been able to afford all that. And again, there's very limited evidence for mail as well. There's not a whole lot of surviving armor fragments from the time. This is where we get to the crux of the issue. Can a Viking beat a knight? In your dreams, maybe. Think about it. Realistically, what does the most well-equipped Viking have at his disposal? Iron helmet. The knight has a steel helmet, and a much better one. A knight can have a helmet with an integrated liner, thicker padding. We don't even have direct evidence of padding with Viking helmets. Did they wear something underneath? I would sure hope so. I've got a knitted cap underneath, which is not particularly thick. It doesn't really do all that much, so I would not want to take a full-powered hit to this helmet. As much as I like these helmets stylistically, they look great, but in terms of functionality, not amazing. I would not want to have to fight in this, and a hit is very likely to knock you out or give you brain hemorrhaging or even crack your skull underneath. Is it better than no helmet? Absolutely. But compared to a knight's helmet, no contest. The knight's helmet is made of better material and thicker and protects better, has a visor, potentially. It's no contest. Then mail, think about it. A Viking's main armor is a knight's weak spot. They likely had better padding too under the mail. Look at that king, deviously stabbing a man while he's helpless, either putting on or taking off his mail. Great honor, your highness. Chivalry, right guys? Again, as far as I know, there's no direct evidence of padding under mail worn by Viking warriors. Nothing survives. I find it hard to believe that they would just wear the mail on top of nothing but clothing. I mean, thick winter clothing, that's all right. But other than that, that would suck. Either way, probably not as advanced as a gambeson or arming doublet. And then limb armor. The knight is covered all the way. Sure, if you go with an early knight, it's not that much more armor, but if you boil it down, an early medieval knight is more or less a well-equipped Viking on a horse. I'm simplifying a little bit, but it's not too far off, so what's the point of comparing? The knight has gauntlets and hand protection is very useful. Doesn't matter much if you're using a large shield, but if you're using a two-handed weapon, like a Dane axe or a spear with both hands, then yeah, the hands are a little bit exposed. The knight has way more armor, which is also thicker and made of better material, steel compared to iron. But wait a moment, you might say, what about the Varangian guard? They had more armor. At that point, you're not dealing with the average Viking warrior anymore. Not because it's a super Viking, but because it's not a Viking at all. Sorry. The Varangian Guard, which by the way could also include Anglo-Saxon warriors, not just Scandinavian, was formed in the Byzantine Empire in the 10th century, so at the tail end of the Viking Age. And at first, they didn't have that much different equipment, but then as time went on, more and more armor was added. You know, of course, being funded by the Byzantine Emperor affords you a little bit more protection, but the better the armor gets, the further away we get from the end of the Viking Age. But even at the start, if you settle down and seek employment by an emperor, you're not a Viking anymore. You're not going Viking. The shield is pretty good. The knight may have a more durable shield, but the nice thing about this is that it can trap an opponent's blade. And like a sword can get stuck right in there and then you might be able to control it. So it's going to get destroyed more quickly, but in the meantime, there are some neat things. I wouldn't rate it more highly than a knightly shield necessarily. They each have pros and cons. But here's where it gets ugly. So the Viking has a spear. Nice, right? The king of weapons. Except the knight has something better. The Viking has a big old axe which can be swung with two hands and do reasonable damage to armor. The knight has a much heftier axe with more functionality that also has a hammer and a spike on top, and well, it's slower because it weighs more, but it hits quite a bit harder and it can thrust too. Well, so can this, but against a knight in armor, no. This is not going to do anything. The Viking has a sword. The knight has a better sword. Again, made of better material and more different designs to choose from. I mean, on average, if you compare a Viking sword to an average arming sword, whatever that means, considering all the different variations, then the Viking sword should deliver more powerful cuts, potentially. It tends to have a broader blade and has a little bit more mass overall, but the knight could be using a falchion instead, which also chops very powerfully and has more of a guard. And some people may see these iconic warriors in an epic battle like RoboCop versus Terminator, but really in terms of equipment, it's more like RoboCop versus Kyle Reese. And if I may remind you, one of these two broke his neck falling downstairs. Sure, hit and run, guerrilla tactics, all of that can be somewhat effective, but it's just very much outgeared, so to speak. But here's how the Viking can win anyway, just the same way as they did in history, by not fighting. You just sail along the river, show up out of nowhere, plunder the village, slay anyone who gets in your way, load up the loot, and burn it and leave before the knight can show up. Except the Viking raids inspired a change in organization away from centralized leadership and toward boosting local defenses with shorter response time. So in a way, the knight is the natural counter to the Viking raider. Otherwise, in a one-on-one duel or in a field battle, let's just be realistic, the Viking is really outclassed. I mean, it's like asking who would win, Revolutionary War soldiers with muskets or World War I soldiers with bolt-action rifles? What do you think, buddy? Feel free to argue in the comments, and by that I mean have a civil discussion, but this is where I stand. Hope you found this interesting and entertaining. Thanks for watching. Take care, folks. Keep raiding. Or, I don't know, fighting the French in some dumb war because your king demands it.